Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. Even as someone who's been a critic of this Labour government from the left and criticised them on their rightward lurch on immigration, refugee rights, trans rights, and so on, even I sometimes have to remind myself just how quickly we've moved to the right on so many issues, both relative to international peers and even to past governments. I wanted to take a minute on the podcast to just go through some of that and what it means for ordinary people's lives. My guest today to do that is Dan Sohege. Amongst other things, they are a content creator of short-form videos breaking down what's happening in British public policy in a accessible way. So I thought they'd be someone good to have on to discuss this. And then I end with a question that I've been wrestling with, which is, can Labour come back from this? Ought they to come back? That's a wild question to be asking of a new government with a majority this big, this soon in, but here we are. As always, if you like the show, consider supporting it on Patreon. I don't have any commercial sponsors, institutional backers, or do any ads on the podcast. It's just me. Everything I do is made possible by the voluntary support of listeners. And if you already do support, thank you so much for that. If you don't, consider checking out my Patreon. Links on the website. Apart from that, let's get straight to it. This is Can Labour Come Back? With Dan Sohege. I am joined today by Dan Sohege. Dan, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me on, Toby. It's great to be here.
I've got a sort of behind the scenes in the trade question for you first. You've been doing short form video updates on politics for a little bit now, right?
Yeah, for probably a couple of years now, I think.
How have you found that? Because I think we meaning, I don't know, left of centre, progressive politics, talky types, all recognise that's a format we need to be on and get good at,
Hmm.
and perhaps haven't been so much. I thought yours are pretty good. Like, how have you found doing that, the impact they've had, doing that sort of format?
Um, it's picked up a bit sort of over the last probably 6 to 8 months. I think I've hopefully got a bit better at it now than I was when I first started, which has made an impact. But it can be quite challenging at times because you're trying to condense normally quite complex issues. The reason you're doing the short form videos is to explain complex issues to people about politics, about immigration, about rights, into really no more than 3 minutes.
Hmm.
So the number of takes it can need for just that one video. When I first started doing them, I had this strange idea in my head that, oh, well, it's fine. Yeah, I'll just do a quick 3 minute video. That's all it'll take. And it's like 2 hours later, I'm there going, okay, I need to redo that and re-say that. And so it's a lot more complicated than it comes across as, I think. But it's also proven to be really impactful for people. I think it helps them get a message across so much more simply than just writing things out or doing threads on Blue Sky, for example. People engage with them more. And I find that, yeah, I get a lot of positive feedback off people saying it's helped them understand things.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm a Blue Sky person. I write threads on Blue Sky, but I think we have to be real about what those are doing. Those are sort of talking to other people in our sort of, engaged
Hmm.
liberal lefty politics people. And there's times where you want to do that, but there are also times where you need to reach people more broadly.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of my work is advocacy, and big part of advocacy is that you've got to break out of the bubble. There's no point just explaining to things to people who already know it and who already believe what you're saying and go, oh, well, I'll engage with that. You've got to, most people are in the don't knows category. Anytime you talk about politics, it's always a thing. Most people fall into that middle ground of they don't really know about the issue, so they don't comment on it. They don't pay attention. And it's those sorts of people who it's trying to engage with and get them to understand this is what the situation is. This is how it impacts on people.
So what are you trying to do? Like, what ideological perspective are you coming from, and what like issues or information are you trying to bring to people?
Um, I'm never quite. I'll be honest. I'm never quite sure what ideological perspective I come from because I don't really think about that. I come from stuff from a social justice point of view. Really, I work very much on issues like immigration and asylum, trans rights, disability rights, human rights in general. Um, it's less. I think with me, it's less an ideology and more that I've worked policy for quite a long time, and I worked private sector policy. Prior to that, I was a journalist and a newspaper editor. And I kind of just got very annoyed with the fact I was saying stuff that I knew was not correct and seeing people basically punching down marginalized groups and those who didn't have that voice to speak out. For me, there's certain issues which are very personally relevant, and then there's issues which I think, well, no, someone needs to be speaking out on this in this way. And that's where I come from on it. And because of that, I done lots of things, got new degrees and masters and stuff. So I was better educated in talking about specific issues. And that's where I've led off from. And I used what I've learned in policy from working in the private sector, which involved things like working for finance organizations and construction companies, to now working predominantly human rights areas.
I might want to come back to the British media and potential deficiencies therein. I did want to ask you today, I said just before we came on, someone said to me recently on social justice issues, this Labour government is now far worse than any of their Tory predecessors. And I hadn't thought about it in quite those terms before. Like, I'm a lifelong Labour person. I mean, I've been vocal against some of the things that they've done. But just to have it in a moment, I was like, yeah, that's right. Like, could you give us a summary? And perhaps we can get into, I'll ask questions to get into some more of the specifics. What the hell has happened to this government over the past year or so?
That's a very good question. In practice, they have shifted far further to the right than we've seen previously. Now, this isn't to defend what happened with the previous government. They brought through some hideous policies. And anytime I start talking about this and saying we need to look at the context and everything all together, I will always get people saying, well, what about the Rwanda policy, for example? And that was an absolutely hideous policy, which no one is denying that, on the left side of things, that was an absolutely hideous policy. But when you look at what Labour's doing in its entirety, in practice, and they're actually managing to get through and enforce, they, in a lot of ways, have gone further to the right than the previous government did on issues like immigration and asylum, on trans and non-binary rights, on disability rights with potential cuts to PIP and backdooring removal of support via access to work and things. We're seeing this very rightward shift for it, which the argument being put forward from certain Labour MPs, particularly in the cabinet, is it's necessary because we're seeing a rise of reform and hard right policies. On a practical level, and it doesn't actually make sense for the government to be doing this. Because if you look at all the polling of where they're losing support, and they are now losing massive amounts of support, not just one-off by-elections, but consistently over polling, they're losing it to the Greens and the Lib Dems. They're not gaining anything from reform because they can't go far enough. Anytime they up the ante on things, reform can always go a bit further, as we've seen with reform's immigration policies. But it's this whole blue Labour thing, in inverted commas, of they seem to be trying to chase that right wing vote while losing the progressive vote. So politically, it makes no sense. But in practice, we are seeing with their immigration policies that they've been announcing, not just the ones that came out recently, but back in May last year, they brought out the immigration white paper, their asylum policies, their policies when regarding trans rights or lack thereof, including schools guidance. They're becoming incredibly regressive on basic rights. They're even talking about restricting rights under the European Convention on Human Rights for people seeking asylum to make it easier to deport them. That's something that even a couple of years ago we would never have dreamed to be hearing from a Labour government, that particularly one which is being run by a former human rights barrister. That they're saying,
We
well,
spend a few minutes going through some of these in detail because I've made the critique at length in a number of venues that this is not an efficacious political strategy. As you just said, they're losing support on the left flank without gaining it on the right. I think that's true. I've said that ad nauseum over the past year. But not everything is electoral politics. It is also just like, it is worth spending a bit of time on just like what some of these policies are and what they're doing. Can we start with the refugee one, making refugee, because I think you do a good job of explaining potential consequential but potentially quite confusing issues concisely. Um, the Home Secretary Mahmood has announced that refugee status will now be temporary. What does that mean? How would that impact the life of someone who, say, has fled here because of war or persecution?
so what she's saying is that refugees will have to reapply every 2.5 years, as opposed to at the moment, refugee status is about 5 years, and then you can apply for settlement or apply to remain. What that means in practice is that you are leaving people in limbo, because you're also extending the period before refugees can actually apply for settlement. So you're leaving people in this perpetual limbo. Now, that has very significant consequences on individuals who are often already highly traumatized. So putting them in that position denies them ability to feel safe and secure. So you have significant mental health issues, which leads quite often to physical health issues. That obviously is counterproductive for the government in terms of them saying, well, we need to do this because asylum seekers are a drain on infrastructure and stuff. Where it has an additional risk, and this goes completely contrary to the Home Office's own reasoning for this, is they already are having people waiting a year, 2 years. In some cases, it can be 10 years for some people plus to have an asylum application processed. Now, if you're then having to redo applications every 2.5 years, that's an increased workload. So that's increased cost for the Home Office. And they don't have the staff to do it. The Refugee Council, I saw one of their policy people mentioning that it would be about 1 million people, 1 million additional applications over a 10-year period. They just physically can't do it. But the idea is to play to this thing of saying, oh, well, refugee status should never be permanent. It should be temporary. Now, only the other week, the Home Secretary specifically said that was what the Refugee Convention envisaged for it. She said it was never
Sorry
intended.
to interrupt you, but it isn't, right? Tell us.
This is the thing. The Refugee Convention very, very specifically states, Article 34, that it is the responsibility of a state, once someone has been provided with refugee status, once they're recognised as a refugee, that the state should expedite naturalisation, including reducing or removing any costs involved in it. They should make it as easy as possible.
This was one of the, I deal with political arguments I disagree with all the time. Just every now and again, something gets under my skin. And when she said that, I actively got angry. I was like, no, it doesn't say that. And it's contrary to both the letter and the spirit of it.
Absolutely.
And the whole idea of this is like, because the government is now talking about like, once we deem your home country safe, we'll send you back. And that's just completely like not how human beings and human relationships work. You're going to come, you're going to make relationships, friendships, romantic relationships, have a family if you're here for, 10 years, whatever. And then, oh, in theory, the war stopped, so now you have to go home. That just seems both preposterous and incredibly, incredibly cruel.
It is on both things. It is a totally inhumane policy. We saw it though when the previous Home Secretary Yvette Cooper paused asylum applications for Syrians after Assad was removed. Should we put that nicely? But that didn't take into account the reality of what people go through when they seek asylum, what they've already gone through. And pretty much every study on this shows that a country ceasing to be a conflict or a law changing that ceases to apply persecution directly to that group does not make a country necessarily safe for somebody to return to, because safety is recognized as being a very personal thing. And if you've fled, you're not going to feel safe going back to that place for years or potentially ever. And that's where the refugee protection order comes in.
And even if you could be sure, which you can't, if someone's been here for a decade, they're going to have formed connections with people, connections with the society. They might have a family. And we're going to rip all that up and just deny the right to a family life to both the individual, but also say potentially a British citizen who they might have formed a relationship with. Because what? Because the right-wing press is yelling at us?
This is something they very specifically have said and are doing. We had Mike Tapp a while back now talking about the potential that when they were about removing refugees with changes to the asylum rules last year, he was talking about the potential that they could remove UK-born children if their parents were then found to no longer have refugee status and being deported. We saw there's been a recent thing of the government, the Home Office's family returns document, specifically showing that they are talking about removing children in handcuffs. They're talking about restricting rights under the European Convention on Human Rights, including the right to the family, to allow for increased deportations. I mean, these are things which they go against every principle that you can imagine for what the law is actually putting out there, for what refugee protection is putting out there, and just basic humanity and rights. This is something that, as I said before, would not be considered previously. It is now being touted as, well, we have to do this so we prevent the rise of the right wings. Yes, but you're enacting the very policies that they're talking about. So you've become what you're claiming to oppose. And that seems to be the trajectory that we're seeing on this.
One that I feel, because there is some, my understanding at least, considerable internal pushback within the Labour Party, although, that always never seems to quite come to as much as you might hope it would. Another one in which I think you could make an unfavourable comparison between the current government and either international peers or prior Conservative governments is trans rights. When I wrote about this, I made the point that in 2016, when American states started doing bathroom bans, we actually in the UK put American states on travel advisories because of that. And Labour MPs in Parliament confidently predicted such a thing would never happen here. And then it just happened. Albeit via a very complicated process that we needn't get into. But it now seems to be the position of the government that, well, actually, it is not straightforwardly clear what their position is, but it is not trans-inclusive. And if you take the EHRC guidance literally, which even they at times seem not to, but if you take it literally, that would put us in a more authoritarian position than even a lot of American red states are. Certainly well to the right of something like the US Democrats or peer parties in Europe. Certainly, but to the right of Theresa May or something,
Saying Theresa May is actually a really good benchmark for this because, yes, they have gone further to the right on so many issues than Theresa May, the architect of the hostile environment. That is not a good place to be. on trans rights, I mean, the Good Law Project has done some superb work on this of strategic litigation, but a lot of these cases are still going on. And they they've got a very muddled view. They've very much, it seems, come across as misreading and misinterpreting the Supreme Court judgment that we had last year anyway.
Yeah.
But they're doing things like bringing out their schools guidance, which is referred to by quite a number of people, including myself, Section 28 2.0.
Could you explain that to us? Because I gave a quick review of what's going on with single-sex space access, and I spent a lot of time on that. I confess I haven't caught up on the new schools guidance. What are you referencing when you say Section 28 for the audience?
Right.
What's this guidance doing?
So this guidance it brings in sort of how teachers should or should not discuss gender identities, trans lives, and it restricts them talking about it. It has a very focused on biological sex, restricts discussions about social transitioning, advises against teaching that everybody has a gender identity. It changes, part of it is changing using terminology such as transgender with gender questioning, which is seen to undermine a lot of people's lives and their lived experience, including young people. So what it does in essence, and one of the other big things, is it allows teachers to inform parents if their child wants to or does identify as a different gender at school. Now, that's incredibly risky. I grew up under Section 28, and I remember people
So
being...
Section 28 is a Thatcher-era policy that prohibits the discussion of homosexuality in schools,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. And that was repealed under the last Labour government. And what happened from that was if parents being informed that their child was gay, the child could face abuse at home. So we're liable to see that sort of thing happening again. But it restricts children in particular being able to fully access information about their own selves, about how they identify, which has been proven repeatedly, multiple studies around the world on this one, to have incredibly harmful impacts upon their mental health. We are seeing at the moment an increase in trans young people committing suicide. And I'm always wary about drawing direct links, but it does show that we need to be paying far more attention to helping support trans young people. And this goes directly against that. It reduces support for them.
You also mentioned disability rights. I admit I haven't gone into this one. I've been yowling at them about refugees and the EHRC thing. Could you give us an overview of what's happening there?
So it's happening in several different ways. We had big thing last year of the government trying to reduce access to personal independence payments. Again, as with a lot of these things that are pushed through, there was a lot of very misleading rhetoric around that. It was being pushed as, well, this is to help get people into work, when PIP is not an out-of-work benefit. It actually helps people to work. But they were looking at restricting that. There's been talk of putting work coaches in mental health wards, which the myriad of ways that can go wrong and stress upon people, I don't think needs full analysis. Just the idea of putting a work coach in a mental health ward is very obviously not a good idea. I don't know if they're progressing with that one. That was something that was floated, though. There's routinely talk from senior ministers about overdiagnosis of autism and ADHD. Now, I'm autistic, so I take that one quite personally because I know how hard it is to get an autism diagnosis. And it's been shown, only a study the other day came out, medical experts did an in-depth study of it and found no, there isn't an overdiagnosis, but it's still being repeated if there is. And it's all these things combined, this constant chipping away at things and trying to say, well, if you are not, well, let's put it this way, what a lot of it boils down to across immigration and the disability side in particular, is the government says, if you are not earning a certain amount of money, if you're not a high earner, you are valued less than somebody else. if you are unable to work, you are valued less than somebody else. This is the message which is coming across from this, from the way it's done.
And this is
Which is,
overtly just part of it is part of existing law, British law in many respects. So we haven't even talked about the earned settlement immigration reforms, but it has been a part of British law for some time now that you need to be above a certain income threshold in order to marry someone from a different country. So your right to family life in this country for some time now has been directly tied to your earning. And then the position of both the prior Conservative government, this is one where they are actually just picking it up from the Tories, albeit making it worse. And now the Labour government is that amount has to go up and it has to be qualified in further ways against. So it's not just that you have to be earning sort of like a full-time wage to marry someone who lives
more.
abroad. You now have to be earning like a middle class wage to
It's about 29,000 that you have to be earning.
up from 18.
Up from 18.
Yeah.
And that was intended to go up further. But fortunately, there was a block put on that. But it seems likely that that might still go up again at some point. Now, that rules out, I seem to recall the study done on it was about 3/4 of the UK population from being able to marry somebody if they were not born in the UK.
But to your point about that, to disability, to everything, I just mention it as another example. This seems very, very counter to what a liberal, much less a nominally socialist party should be standing on, that certain widely recognized rights are directly tied to earnings.
This is the same policies as we saw under David Cameron.
Yeah.
This is not the policies of a liberal government like that. It is definitely not one that wants to claim it's to the left. They are emulating policies that we have seen very specifically from right-wing parties, centre-right to further to the right on that. And they are trying to mask this. Every time we see these policies come out, we hear ministers saying, well, this is how we have to do this as a progressive party. Well, no, you are actively going against progressive values for this. If they were being honest and saying, yeah, we're going to the right, then I think more people would have a little bit more, they wouldn't get the support, but people would be able to go, okay, you've admitted it, at least. They're not doing that. They're still trying to pretend they are centre-left or left-wing, while enacting policies which are very much right-wing and based on, if you don't earn this amount of money, you have fewer rights than other people. And that's, I think, a quite scary place to be in at the moment. It's also...
Sorry.
I was going to say, it's politically inane, for want of a better word, because they're not gaining any votes. They're losing votes for it. And all the while, they're saying, oh, well, we're doing this to counter reform. Except they are telling people, we have this issue. We have an immigration issue. We have too many people who are registered as disabled. We have this, we have that. Which plays to reform's arguments. They're actually reinforcing reform's arguments rather than countering them. Which means reform then can gain support because they can say, well, look, the government's admitted this is an issue, but they're not doing anything about it.
And you just reinforce the sense, I mean, in the case of immigration, quite directly reinforce the sense, because you're literally saying it, that this is a massive problem and the number one issue facing the country, and that's just not what you want to put on the electorate's head if you're running a centre-left party. But let me ask this. Is there anything good to balance any of this out? Because I have been criticised for, I imagine you have too, neglecting to mention that stuff has happened with workers' rights or the environment or housing. What's the name in The Guardian? Polly Toynbee had a column, which I thought was good and beginning to get it, where she sort of said what we've both been saying. Look, they're bleeding support to the left without compensating to the right. But even in that column, she had an attack on left critics who she described as beyond all reason, who could only see the negative with this government and couldn't credit them with anything positive. Is there anything to that attack? Should we be celebrate? Is there genuinely progressive stuff to celebrate here? And should we, I think me and you both, be paying more attention to it?
They have brought in some progressive policies, and that can be recognised. They have an issue with their comms on this,
Mm.
and it's a big issue that they've got. For example, when they first came in, they removed the whip from a number of Labour MPs who abstained or voted against maintaining the two-child benefit cap.
Mhm.
I think we all can remember that one right at the beginning. They said, no, we aren't dealing with this at the moment. We need to wait. And they removed the whip. That was a bad move, in my opinion, because it had already been proven that the two-child benefit cap needed to go. They have removed that, though. And that is a great thing. That is a really progressive thing that they've done. They did it. There used to be a thing, I don't know if this government still does it. Alistair Campbell brought in, I believe it was, a thing called the grid, which was the idea that you have individual policies that you focus on for that week or that day. You announce them, so nothing got overlapped and you didn't drown out your own message. The problem that they've got is when they do things which are positive, like removing two-child benefit cap, the employment rights bill, renters' rights bill, they then drown it out themselves by announcing something to the right, because they're trying to play both sides against the centre, or almost on this one. They're going, look, we're doing this progressive policy, but don't worry for you guys over there, because we're also doing this right-wing policy at the same time. And that means that no one's got a consistent message from them. So they are doing progressive things, but they keep shooting themselves in the foot by then doing the right-wing things at the same time. And I don't think with the levels we can say that they balance out, because
Yeah, that was going to be my
some
next
of the
question.
regressive things are so regressive and denying basic fundamental rights or potentially violating international law. You can't really balance out the two on that one and say, well, they did that policy, so that then balances out that policy, if that makes sense.
I think that's where I'm at because certainly their own messaging has not been optimal, to put it at its mildest, right? It's just, I find it interesting. They're just not very good at this. Like they're not very good communicators. None of them are. Um, so you can certainly fault them on messaging. I guess a Labour supporter, like I referenced that Guardian column, could still say, well, okay, but people like Toby and Dan, who only ever talk about the bad things Labour have done, could also spend a bit of time talking about the good things. I guess, sure, I usually do ask it as a question in interviews. Um, but I think I'd land on the same place as you, is taken the balance of what they've done, I would prefer that they'd done nothing.
Yeah, I think that's a fair one. I recently was working for an organisation with a coalition on the employment rights bill, trying to get better protections for migrant workers in there. So I spent a lot of time reading and analysing bits and pieces for the employment rights bill. And they have the ability to do really good policies. But then they water them down, or as we said, their comms is just massively bad. They're not very good at politics. They're trying to let comms lead the policy by
How
going,
good
right,
is the employment rights thing? Because the getting rid of the two-child cap, they had to be dragged kicking and screaming, but sure, fine, they did it. That's a good thing, right? I've wrapped my head around that one. Um, Building new housing, good. My understanding from people who specialize in that is it kind of isn't happening, but
yeah.
sure. How, tell me about the employment rights thing. Is that going to be meaningfully impacting people's job security, pay, dignity at work?
Um, yes and no. Sorry, that's not a great answer. It does do things like ending 0 hours contracts, which
Okay.
are widely used for exploitation. Now, I speak to a lot of people dealing with this, and they warn of unintended consequences from that one, of people who need 0 hours contracts because it works with their lifestyle and flexibility, then not being able to work. So, but overall, yes, they are massively exploitative, and that could be a good thing. It is meant to increase job security. I believe it's banning fire and rehire, which is quite a major one. A couple of years back, we had a whole thing with P&O, just firing a load of staff and then rehiring people on lower wages. So these are good things which should improve a lot of people's lives. But there are also risks of unintended consequence to them. So I said 0 hours contract. There are people who need that sort of contract, and that's going to make things a bit tougher for them. Are employers going to follow them and follow these rules, or are they going to find loopholes? That's a wait and see. But we see it so often with various things with employment law that those who are going to break it are going to break it anyway. And there was talk of bringing in a fee for people to take employers to tribunals. If that comes to pass, and I don't know if that has come to pass or not, then that really does undermine pretty much everything in the Employment Rights Bill, because particularly for the poorest people who can't afford to pay the fee or really can't risk being lumbered with the court costs if they lose, they're not going to be able to hold anybody to account under the bill. So it's a bit of swings and roundabouts.
Yeah, that is the thing in the UK is enforcement is just quite onerous, and anyway, that's that, and like functionally probably precludes the poorest workers anyway, right? But I guess you could say if we're trying to make the case for Starmer and Labour, look, any sort of employment rights will have issues of unintended consequence
Absolutely.
and enforcement. It doesn't mean you don't do it.
Yeah. You never let perfect be the enemy of good.
Right.
You're never going to get something which is perfect for everybody. So doing the best you can, absolutely. And I think they have tried with that. It's not my particular area on the employment rights bill. I've worked on it a bit from the migrants' rights side of things, but which they were very opposed to including specific things in to protect migrant workers on that. But overall, I think it could be beneficial. But there are always going to be risks to these things.
Yeah. And to my mind, I think the bad stuff is just so bad that I don't feel like I don't even know, but like I guess the idea is sort of like letting the left down or like not being a team player by disproportionately focusing on the bad stuff. And also like these are just issues that are concerning and I want to talk about.
I tend to use the analogy of politics is not like a coffee shop card. You don't get one free bigotry with every decent policy that you do. The discriminatory policies, I think, do massively outweigh, in a lot of ways, the positive ones that they're putting forward. And what gets me is they seem to know that. Because I said, when they announce these things, it is always like, we've done this policy which is going to help people. But don't worry, at the same time, we've done this one which is going to target migrants, or it's going to do this, or it's going to reduce rights for trans individuals. They seem determined to negate the positive themselves by going further with the discriminatory and the negative.
So why are they doing this? This is the question I get the most, or the sort of comment or objection I get the most. Do they really believe their own political theory that they have to make policy concessions to cultural conservatives in order to take the wind out of reform's sails? Do they actually believe that, or are they just bigots? That's a question I get all the time.
That's a good question. I think there are how to phrase this one nicely. I think there are senior members of the Labour Party in the cabinet who genuinely are bigots. For want of a better word, they genuinely believe that they want to see these regressive policies in their departments. And I think there are others who believe that this is the only way to counter a rise of reform and to bring on socially conservative, more right-leaning voters. There's a huge thing in Labour of the Blue Labour group, which is quite socially conservative. But at the end of the day, I don't think it comes down to ideology. I think it just comes down to bad politics, to be honest. They're trying to please everybody and then inevitably annoy everybody at the same time. They want to be seen as progressive in certain areas, and that their language very much comes across as that. And then at the same time, they want to be seen as right wing to appeal to those voters. And they'll use the same language to do that. I mean, we see with speeches that are made, we've seen some great speeches saying about how we need to combat racism from the Prime Minister. And then at the same time, we see the Prime Minister going, but we have to understand the concerns of those people who are threatening outside of hotels with asylum seekers and stuff. They're just bad at the politics of it. I think that's where it really boils down to.
That's very much, I mean, you said it in your words, but that's very much my answer to that question, which is it's a bit of both. I think certainly when it comes to the trans stuff, there are people within the Labour Party who are true believers in sort of, I guess, gender critical, that,
Very much so. Yeah.
you know, not all of them, but I think the ones who aren't don't care that much. Like there's a hardcore minority who really care on the other side. There's maybe some on our side, but then there's a broad swathe who's just sort of going along. I
Yeah.
also think, and people really don't believe me when I say this, because when I say no, I think they genuinely do believe that they have to do this politically. People go, but can they not see that it's not working? And like, I guess my answer is they have eyes. Like they see the polling, they see the by-election results, but I think they think anything else would do even worse.
Hmm.
Like that they that there's, I call it reactionary centrism, which is an American term I've imported, but the idea that you have to give policy ground on the idea that a rising far right is a backlash to woke, so to speak, and so you have to compromise on that to win voters back. There's something, although they present themselves as like serious, pragmatic people, they're actually deeply unreasonable. And they really are locked into this worldview and won't think their way out of it. And no, they really think this.
Yeah.
And like they really think that the working class are irredeemably anti-immigrant, and you've just got to meet them where they are. They really think that like if they could just demonstrate that we're serious about this, reform voters will hear it and come back over. They really think that anything to their left at all will just be Corbynism again and will be a disaster. And they really just can't be talked out of it. And people sort of say, but that what you're describing is an insane person. And I'm like, yes, I'm glad you appreciate the scale of the challenge here. But that's, I don't know, that's kind of my view.
No, that's very much where I come from. I think they're embedded in what I've heard used, and I use this occasionally, the X mentality, as in Twitter mentality.
Yeah.
They have got so stuck in this mindset of, oh, we just haven't gone far enough yet. And then demonizing their own side. There was a very famous one of the Prime Minister saying that if you don't like what we're doing, you can leave,
Hmm.
because they're still stuck very much in a two-party mentality of we can do whatever we like because your only other alternative used to be Conservatives, now they use Reform.
Hmm.
They haven't adapted to the fact that, as we saw with the Gorton and Denton by-election, and I'm always wary to use one by-election as an example, but we've also seen it through polling going on over the last year or so. People see that there are alternatives. One of the things that Reform has actually done in the way that it is taken over from the Conservatives is shown left-wing and progressive voters that, oh, we don't have to stick with the old two parties. We can vote for the Greens or vote for the Lib Dems. And Labour hasn't caught up on that. So there's still very much of any vote that isn't for us is de facto a vote for Reform, and using that as a threat. People don't respond well to threats. So, voters like to see a positive. Voters appeal. Positive policies always appeal more. Positive messaging always appeals more. You can't sell a negative. And that's what Labour's doing at the moment, is constantly selling you have to be afraid of this group. You have to be, this group's making life worse for you. This group needs to have fewer rights. They're trying to sell a negative in order to chase reform. But the people who buy into that, where reform is actually good with their messaging, and I hesitate to say that and feel misrepresented. It's not that I support them at all, but where they are good with comms is that they know their audience and they sell them a positive for what that audience wants. People who are supporting reform are worried about their jobs. Reform sells them the idea that migrants are taking the jobs. You get rid of migrants, there'll be more jobs. Now, all the evidence goes against that one, and you're actually going to lose jobs, but that's by the by. They're not overly hassled about facts or evidence or anything like that. Labour hasn't got that sort of mentality amongst its core supporters or those it needs to be appealing to, but it's still trying to sell the negatives. It's not giving them positive policies for the future and positive messaging. What's going to help them? What's going to boost their jobs? What's going to actually help them? And they didn't even really do that when they were selling the fact they got the Employment Rights Act through, because they then undermined it by putting out more negative messaging about migration and everything else. So that's where I'm coming from, is they're stuck in this bubble, this echo chamber of themselves, but they're not appealing to any audience at all with it.
I mean, again, I also don't want to read too much into a single by-election result, but it is in a historically two-party, first-past-the-post system with single-member districts, and, historically 70–80% of the vote goes to two parties, and not in a regional case like Wales or Scotland. In Manchester, neither of the two main parties coming in the top two is a special sort of incompetence. That is an astounding result.
It was, yeah.
Like Badnock, and I always say this, in every interview I do on British politics, we've just got an hour in and haven't mentioned the Tory party, the contemporary Tory party, because it's just not a factor.
They've lost their deposit. I think it's the first time in history of the Conservative Party that they lost their deposit. That is a big thing that I agree, a lot of people aren't talking about.
I've never seen main party leaders, Badnock and Starmer, with worse political instincts. Like they're so tone deaf, both of them. Like you all need to do something else. Like learn to play cricket or bowling or get good at like anything. This is not what you were meant to do,
Neither of them are any good, and it's spectacular. To see the two-party system, as you say, we've got historically a two-party state, first past the post.
We have an electoral
somehow we've ended up with a multi-party.
To just load that in your favour.
Yeah, and we've got two-party leaders who've created a multi-party system somehow by being so inept.
Can Labour come back from this?
No, no. I think there will be a lot of pieces written about this in coming years, and it'll be studied for how the political system in the UK has shifted so dramatically, who's responsible for it, how it's come about. But I think it has shifted. I think we've passed the point of no return on that. The Conservatives, as they stand, have just been completely destroyed, polling-wise. Labour is going the same way.
They won't be opposition next election, much less.
I can't see it. I really can't see it. I think there is more chance of reform being opposition if Labour retains, or the Greens, or there's a coalition of something. But there's more chance of reform.
Can Labour come back? I mean, they are an incumbent government with a 170-seat majority. Are we really saying it's done?
When Boris Johnson won a landslide majority, I very confidently said, well, he is going to be in for at least 2 to 3 terms, because you can't lose a majority of that scale that quickly. And the Conservatives did. So if you'd asked me a number of years ago, I would have said, no, absolutely. They've got a huge majority. They're going to stay. They're polling so low at the moment, and they're not doing anything to change their fortunes. I think they have to own the fact there is a risk that they could get relegated to at least second party.
Oh, I think they could definitely crash out. I think there is a non-0% chance. Now, whether this chance is 5 or 15 or 35%, I don't know. I think there's a non-0% chance neither of the two main parties are in the top two. I know that's wild, but it's not unthinkable anymore. I guess I just ask, is there a way Labour wins re-election? Surely there has to be a path there, but the path is like to stop being dipshits, and to do
Hmm.
that, they have to just learn from their mistakes. And I don't see
They
that.
they need to, quite honestly, they need completely new leadership, new cabinet which isn't tainted by current leadership, reverse course on so many policies. Just do a huge mea culpa and go, look, we've changed everything. We've seen that no one likes this. We've seen that we're not engaging. We've listened. We are reversing course on all of this. Try and do it as one big U-turn instead of drip feeding through a U-turn. Get it out the way of the news cycle. Start over. Then they might have a chance. I mean, we always used to say that a week is a long time in politics. They've got 3 years.
Yeah.
So nothing is out of the bounds of reality. But if they carry on the way they're carrying on, then the, by the end of this parliament, they'll be, I think, irredeemable on it. I think they'll have lost far too much support.
We're
We're going to have a
approaching
huge test in May, and that's going
we're,
to be the break, make or break for them.
we're approaching an inflection point, and I've been saying that this is coming for a long time. And when I first started saying it, it sounded a bit nuts. I think there is a very strong tendency to tactically vote against reform. Part of that is sort of muscle memory from people tactically voting against Tories. I think it's increased. I think there are people out there who find reform frightening in a way, and correctly, in
Yeah.
a way that they didn't find the Tories frightening. And you see that in all these by-elections. People will be pretty pragmatic about not blocking reform. And I think to some degree, the McSweeneys of the world were right to say that this is a weight on our side of the scale, right? This will benefit us.
Yeah.
That wasn't a ridiculous thought. The problem is once you become unpopular enough, it becomes rational for tactical anti-reform voters to not back you. And once you cross that point, it's going to be very, very difficult for you ever to come back. And now you're already there, I think, in Scotland and Wales. I would strongly expect the SNP will sweep the Scottish elections, and then I think come next general, I would expect it to flip to like 50 SNP seats or something.
I'd put that, yeah.
Um, I'm less confident with Wales, but from what I've seen, Plaid Cymru's probably going to do something. So they'll probably carve up Wales between them and Reform, I would think. Now, England, despite this most recent by-election, I think Labour will still, I think it's the bloody incumbent government, be able to make the case we are best placed as the anti-reform vote.
Mm.
But if they keep sliding, there will come a point at which that is no longer true. And the Greens were already able in that by-election. I mean, we know it's just one, but they were able to successfully make the case we are the best tactical anti-reform vote. And once you get past that point, it's going to become very ugly for them indeed, because you're asking people to both vote, you're asking progressives to both vote against their principles and the strategic consideration. And
Yeah.
I don't know if they get that, I don't know how they come back.
I think if they get to that point, then Labour is done, just like the Conservatives have found at the moment with reform on their right. Yeah, if they get to that point, which they are approaching, I would say there is no coming back from it.
They're not quite there, but they're flirting with it.
I I don't think I think May's going to be a big shift for them if they, as predicted, lose as heavily as they're going to. I don't think that is the be all and end all. I don't think that is the absolute marker point where they can't pull it back and they aren't seen as the potential to beat reform. But I think that's going to have they're going to have to really sit down after that and go, we need to change things fast in order to prevent people just saying no. It is the Greens and the Lib Dems we're going to go for.
Final question, and this is one I think about a lot. Um, is there a path back, not in terms of like let me ask it this way. Not in terms of electoral politics, but in terms of sane governance that I'm not even going to say is like wildly progressive or anything, in terms of governance that is not outright hostile to 70-year-old refugee conventions or is not outright hostile to the continued existence of trans people. In terms of having some sort of governance that is, minimally lowercase l liberal, what's our best path back? Because I think we're pretty clearly slipping away from that over the last year, and we will probably slip further either with this government or a reform one. What's our path back? Is it to try and recapture the Labour Party, or is it to invest in the alternative, some mad coalition of Lib Dems and Greens and SNP? Like, because neither of those seem appealing prospects to me. Like recapturing the Labour Party seems rough. There's like it's not just Starmer; they're all locked into it.
Yeah.
All of the leadership, and if they get rid of Starmer and then they put Streeting in or something, it's going to be, what's the point? But at the same time, we are a first the past the post system, and trying to wedge in a progressive coalition of four different parties around an incumbent government, I am not excited about that thought. So neither of those things fill me with joy. But if we want a society that is even minimally liberal, we have to do one of them. I don't know. Like they both seem rough as hell to me, but not from like a political electoral perspective, but just as not being a horrible country. Which of those do you fall down on?
I honestly don't know.
Yeah,
I'm
me
making a
either.
point in my life to not support any particular party. I do it so I avoid disappointment. Um, Instead, I base it, as most people do, on what policies each party is doing at the time, how they're speaking, how they're engaging. And I think that if Labour want to try and regain core votes and create something that works, they need to stop all this negativity, all the anti-immigration, anti-trans policies. But they are still going to need to do something that appeals to centre ground. And that's still going to annoy a lot of people who they've already annoyed on the left. But if they can find a more moderate approach instead of this whole thing of going to, everyone's wanting to go to extremes at the moment, and most voters don't do that. They're in the centre, moderate, don't really understand what's going on with a lot of stuff, so don't pay attention to it, particularly if it doesn't affect them in themselves. If Labour starts targeting that with sensible policies, ones that work and ones which aren't seen as massively extreme, they could possibly bring on enough people to maintain a position. The Lib Dems and the Greens, I could see being an effective coalition, well, being a coalition in the next, after the general election. But there's so many differences between them, and they would also have to bring in support from others, that we've seen the coalition between the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, and I think a lot of voters are still looking at that and going, we're not really sure we want a coalition again. Thanks very much. So if that's the case, they're going to have to both make the case ahead of the general election for how it's going to work if they're going to form a coalition. That's going to annoy their own supporters who want to see their party being the sole party in power. So I really don't know. I think a lot of people are going to have to face reality on a lot of things, that you can't go for the extremes.
Both my American and European listeners seem to want to happen. They're like, can the Greens and Lib Dems not make a pact? And I'm like, that's just sort of not in our political vocabulary and in our muscle memory. And to the extent that it is, it's a very negative experience for us. Like, yes, that might have to be what we do, but that will come with a whole host of its own challenges,
I think if they can start looking at it now and building the foundations for how it would work, I think they've got a really good chance of being able to go, right, we will not put up, so Lib Dems and Greens say we will not put up people to oppose each other in these areas. You're going to annoy your own supporters on that one. But if you can start making the case now for how it could work and get the public round and get your own supporters round on this is the best way to get in government, beautiful, I think they've got a chance. But they're going to have to be talking about it as soon as possible. They can't go into an election saying we are going to win a majority and then because people aren't going to believe that they can for the majority of the public.
See, I can sort of visualize that path. It seems a long way off, but I can sort of visualize it. Retaking the Labour Party, I sometimes just I think it's just because I'm very angry at them, and I am a tribal person, and I am a historic Labour person, and so like it does hit me a bit differently. But like after they lost that election, immediately coming out with an attack on the directly on the voters who switched, and a new raft of anti-refugee measures. Like just and this isn't like the challenge for like the sort of green yellow coalition, which doesn't sound great, but the green yellow coalition is structural. There are structural and institutional barriers there. Like the challenge for Labour is like, have you seen these people? Like, it's like a personality thing almost.
Yeah. Their only hope is to completely remove everybody who is associated with the current Labour leadership, as I said, and completely change course. I don't see that being a practical thing. I'm like you. The statement after the Gorton and Denton loss was just from a political point of view. I heard that and went, sorry, seriously, that's the tack you're taking on
That's what
this.
we're going with.
You're going with, right, our core voters are no longer supporting us, so we're going to call you extremists. That's not going to get people back on side. I don't know who came up with that as a strategy, but they really, really are not very good at either policy or comms or politics in general. But that sums up so much of this government,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But yes, I think it's going to be easier for the Greens and the Lib Dems to navigate a route to a coalition power than for Labour to navigate a route where they can bring back supporters that they've lost.
Because they'd have to purge the cabinet. It wouldn't just be
Yes.
Starmer, it'd be Streeting, it'd be Mahmood, it would be maybe those three, if you hacked them out and put good people in.
You get them out. I think there are arguments to be made for also Yvette Cooper, but that's less public. That's more because it's an area I work in and
Yeah.
things. Same with Bridget Phillipson. But for the public, it is very much Starmer, Streeting, and Mahmood, who you would need to absolutely remove.
Because they're never getting it on their own, I think.
Oh God, no, not a chance. Not a chance.
Okay, so we've got two very bleak and implausible routes there.
Or an interesting time in politics.
Yeah. I worry about this country because I lived in America for a long time and people are like, what is happening in America? I'm like, it's coming here next. We're already seeing parts of it. Anyway, on that bleak note, let's wrap. Dan, thank you so much for your time today. That was great. Do you want to let listeners know? We mentioned your shorts, anywhere they should go online to follow you or anything like that.
Yep, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on. And I can be found on Blue Sky at Daniel Sohege. You can search me as Daniel Sohege, which is Sohege, on TikTok, Instagram. I'm no longer on Twitter, but yeah, Blue Sky and TikTok are the two main ones that I can be found on. That's Daniel Sohege. And yeah, but no, thank you very much for having me on. And also, if you search for Stand for All, then that's where a lot of my stuff can be found.
Cool. Cheers, mate. Appreciate it.
Cheers. No, it's been great. Thanks very much, Toby.